Good Shabbos, my holy sisters and brothers. That was Rabbi Eitan Katz singing Shlomo Carlebach's song, Nachamu. We usually sing that song when we get through the, that series of Shabbats as we head toward Tisha B'Av. And then we come out of Tisha B'Av, the lowest point of the year, and the prophet Isaiah says God will comfort his people. God will comfort our people. And so that is a song of comfort. Nachamu, Nachamu, comfort us. I think we could all use a little comforting, a little peace. Let's talk about peace. Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us on this beautiful Friday as we're getting ready for Shabbos and doing a little bit of learning together? Yehudit Sobel says Shabbat Shalom, wishing all a restful and rejuvenating Shabbos from Florence, South Carolina. Tom saying Shabbat Shalom. Sandy wishing everyone a good Shabbos. Brandon with us from Alabama. Christina saying Shabbat Shalom. Mamang says Shillong, which I'm not sure what that... Oh, is in Shillong, which I'm not sure where that is. Where are you, Mamang? What country is that? Richard Stein says good Shabbos to all. Richard Stein, we've been looking for you. Thank you so much for your support of our non-profit. We'd love to reach out to you and say thank you properly. Christina's with us from Brazil. Stephen from Dover, New Hampshire. Oskin is with us from Turkey. Welcome, Oskin. We're very international today. Benedito also with us from Brazil. Randy from Florida. Linda... Linda saying Shabbat Shalom from North Carolina. Mamang is with us from Shillong in India. Welcome, welcome. It's so great. This is awesome. Everyone's tuning in today from Brazil, from Turkey, from India. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Lucy with us from Minnesota. Stephen says Gesundheit from Texas. Ann says is with us from Merced. Pauline from Arkansas. Gava from Honolulu. Nancy from North Carolina. Amy from Oregon. Adrian from Montana. Sammy is with us from Dallas. Welcome all. Lindsay, I believe, from Cincinnati. And Lynn from North Texas. All right, we've got some work to do. We've got a double daf today. We didn't have a show yesterday. Because we had the beautiful treat and privilege of having a live show with Nina in the kitchen. If you missed that, it's on our page, and you should see just how Nina makes challah. I'm telling you, it's the tastiest challah in the world. And then you can see just how she makes it, and also the love and spirituality that goes into the dough and into the baking. That was a good show. So today we're gonna do a double daf and make up for the page that we missed yesterday and stay on the same daf yomi schedule with the whole world. We'll be on the schedule at that point. We don't have to be on the schedule. Sometimes we'll fall behind it. We've only been behind a day. I don't think we've ever even been 2 days behind. But the last time I went through the whole cycle, stuff comes up in life, and sometimes you can fall a few days behind. And luckily there are short dafs here and there, and we can make it up and get on schedule. All right. Let's get into it. As we were learning on Wednesday, so Rabbi Chananya ben Akavya permitted 3 activities to the residents of the Sea of Tiberias. That's the same as the Sea of Galilee. So there were some special leniencies that the local authority there, Rabbi Chananya ben Akavya, permitted to the residents who lived around the Sea of Galilee. Why? Because it was a very well-populated area. And everybody who had, lakefront property, as it were, was living in some kind of a town with enclosures. And so in terms of carrying on Shabbos and transfer from one domain to another on Shabbos, it was, in his opinion, some further leniencies were possible because everything was transpiring within enclosures. And so as we saw, one of those leniencies that he gave permission for the people up there is that if they had a balcony over the Sea of Galilee, they could draw water up through a hole in the balcony That permit, that leniency of the sages exists for everyone everywhere, but only if they have mechitzos, if they have partitions that extend upward or downward from that hole in the balcony. So when you're drawing water up through it, it's like you're not taking water from a Carmelis, which is a rabbinically decreed domain that is neither a private domain nor a public domain, and lakes and seas and rivers qualifies a Carmelis. So you would be taking water from the Carmelis into your private domain, which would be prohibited on Shabbos. But when you're pulling it up through a hole in the balcony, if there are these partitions that extend upward or downward from the hole, it's as if you have your own well, your private well that extends down into the water, and you're really drawing water from your own well, as it were, and that well would then be subsumed into the private domain of the homeowner, and it's okay to draw water in that way. Rabbi Chananya ben Akavya takes it a step further, and he says that as long as the balcony is large enough, then we're going to pretend as if the sort of strips in the wood of the balcony could be folded up or folded down to form those partitions, even though the partitions had not been formed. That leniency did not take root in the Jewish world, as it were, and it was only sort of at that time and in that place under the authority of Rabbi Chananya. He also said that the residents who lived around the Sea of Galilee, kind of a technical thing, that they could insulate food with the husks of legumes on Shabbos. Normally there was a prohibition by the sages to insulate food on Shabbos to keep it warm. They said you can't do that with moist straw. Because it's almost like they thought that there was like a chemical reaction that could go on in moist straw that would actually add heat, and it might come to cook or boil water on Shabbos. And then that prohibition extended to other kinds of materials if they were moist, and there was a concern that the husks of legumes could be that way. But the residents in that area didn't want moist legumes, they wanted dry legumes, and so this was not a concern. We're not going to really discuss that. The third ruling of Rabbi Chananya ben Akavya is that people could dry themselves with a towel. So this is pretty important in that area on Shabbos. The whole point is that they could use a towel on Shabbos. Now, we've discussed this before. It's not really for today. This question of whether people can go in a swimming pool, for example, on Shabbos. Whether you can bathe. I mean, for sure you can't take a hot shower on Shabbos because heating up the water, kindling fire, if you have a hot water heater, it's going to heat up the water. That's not permissible on Shabbos. But if you have some kind of a body of water, like a swimming pool, can you jump in? And there's a bunch of concerns, and most authorities will say no swimming on Shabbos. One of the reasons is that you might splash water out of the pool into a neighboring domain. A different concern is that you might come to dry yourself with a towel. That's not the problem. The problem is if you have a soaking wet towel, for whatever reason, maybe the towel falls in the pool. It's not just that you dried your body with it, but the towel got totally wet. If you wring out the towel, if you squeeze water out of the towel, that is a biblically prohibited labor on Shabbos. A Jew is not permitted to wring liquid out of a fabric on Shabbos. This was one of the 39 labors that were necessary to construct the tabernacle when the children of Israel were in the desert. It was part of the dyeing process, right? So like the fabrics that were used to construct the tabernacle, which was essentially a large tent, but it was colored, they were dyed fabrics, and part of the dyeing process is, you put the fabric in the dye, you soak it with the dye, then you wring out the excess dye, and so that is a constructive labor, and we do not do constructive labors on Shabbos. That's actually a specifically prohibited labor on Shabbos. So the concern was that somebody who's using a towel might come to do the same thing. But Rabbi Chananya ben Akavya said, we're not concerned about that. The people know better than to wring out their towels. And in this ruling, it seems like it took root in the greater Jewish world. And so before we leave this ruling behind, I'll just read you the law with respect to using a towel on Shabbos. It is permitted to dry oneself with a towel on Shabbat, and even to bring it home. Like, so if you went in the water somewhere where it was permitted to go in, and then you dry yourself with it. So then they said, at one point they said, well, and you can't carry the towel home, right? Because if you carry the towel home, you might forget that you have a wet towel, and when you get home, before you go in the house, you might wring it out. Same concern. So the prohibition was a rabbinic decree just to protect people from coming to wring out the towel. But eventually they decided that was not necessary, that people know better than to wring out their towels on Shabbos. However, one may not give it to the bathhouse attendants because it is suspected that they will wring it out, right? So if you use a towel on Shabbos, okay, then you're responsible for the towel. You dry yourself with it, you hang it somewhere, and it's on you to make sure that you don't and nobody else comes to wring out the towel on Shabbos. Okay, and those were the three leniencies of Rabbi Chananya ben Akavya. With respect to drawing water through a hole with partitions in a balcony, right? So we've discussed that is permitted. You can draw water up through a hole. In other words, take a bucket on a rope, and you have a balcony over the water, and you can lower it through that hole in the balcony as long as there are these partitions about 10 handbreadths high, either above or below the hole. So we can bring water up into our balcony and from there into our home. May we pour out wastewater through the same hole? What is the concern? If water can come in, water should be able to go out. But the concern is that if you pour the water out through this hole, where's it going to end up, right? Isn't it going to like go down and then flow around and end up going from your private domain out beyond these sort of the boundaries, these kind of like legalistic, what's the word? Like a legal construct of those boundaries that extend down from your partitions around the hole. But when you pour water out, it's going to end up going further away than where it fell down. And it's like you will end up being responsible for transferring water from a private domain out into a Carmelis. That was the concern. And hold on a second. And Rabbah bar Rav Huna said, no, for that reason. We may draw water in through the hole in the balcony, but we may not pour water out. Rav Shesvi challenged him and says, why not? As we see in the next Mishna, which we're about to talk about, the sages are not concerned that water will end up leaving that domain. And so we can sort of ascribe this to the general leniency of the sages with respect to the laws of Eruv and transferring on Shabbos when it comes to water. They're lenient about drawing water, and they're going to be lenient about pouring water out as well. And so it is permitted, if you have such a hole in your balcony, to draw water in and also to toss water out on Shabbos. That brings us to Mishnah number 9 of chapter 8. And that is the last Mishnah. I didn't say at the beginning, where are we? We're doing a double daf. We're in Tractate Eruvin, the 3rd volume of the Talmud. We're doing 2 pages, 88 and 89. So that's Pei Ches and Pei Tes, pages 88 and 89. And we're completing chapter 8 with the 9th Mishnah, which we're about to do. And then we're going to open chapter 9 with the first Mishnah of chapter 9. All right, let's read the final Mishnah, Mishnah number 9 here of chapter 8. With regard to a courtyard that is less than 4 cubits in area, and by which, 4 by 4. They're not saying 2 cubits by 2 cubits. If it's a courtyard that is less than 4 cubits by 4 cubits, in other words, 16 square cubits, it's still pretty small, right? So a cubit is about that. So 4 of them is about 6 feet. So you're imagining if there's a courtyard that's about 6 feet by 6 feet, right? 2 meters by 2 meters. And this is going to be the whole courtyard. Normally we're thinking about courtyards as well. A courtyard has multiple houses in it. But you can also imagine that a courtyard exists like between houses. I mean, especially in an urban setting, you could easily have a small courtyard between two buildings, and the rules are going to be similar. Now, so if you have a small courtyard that's less than 4 cubits by 4 cubits, one may not pour wastewater into it on Shabbat unless a pit was fashioned to receive the water, and the pit holds 2 sa in volume from its edge. 2 sa is, I think, about 4 gallons, something like that. Or I think a sa is 4 gallons, so maybe 2 of those. So this halacha applies whether the pit was fashioned outside the courtyard or whether it was dug inside the courtyard itself. The only difference is as follows. If the pit was dug outside in the adjoining public domain, it is necessary to arch over it so that the water will not flow into the public domain. If it was dug inside the courtyard, it is not necessary to arch over it. I think by arch they mean cover it, or you know, to make sure that there's sort of barriers around it so that it doesn't overflow easily. And Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says, in the case of a drainage ditch, whose first 4 cubits are arched over in the public domain, one may pour wastewater into it on Shabbos. And the rabbis say, even if a roof or a courtyard is 100 cubits in area, one may not pour water directly into the mouth of the drainage ditch. However, he may pour it upon the roof from which the water spills into the drain of its own accord. A courtyard and a portico, meaning a roofed but unwalled structure in front of a house, combine for the 4 cubits by virtue of which it is permitted to pour water into a courtyard that lacks a pit. And likewise with 2 upper stories, one opposite the other in the same small courtyard, if the residents of one of them fashioned a pit in the courtyard and the residents of the others did not fashion a pit, those who fashioned a pit are permitted to pour their wastewater into the courtyard, whereas those who did not fashion a pit are prohibited to do so. So the bottom line here is, let's say you've got kind of an urban setting, you've got 2 buildings, there's a small courtyard between them. If the courtyard is somewhat large or large, bigger than 6 feet by 6 feet, so then they can pour water into it. If it's small, if it's quite small, less than 6 feet by 6 feet for this whole courtyard, then they're not going to be allowed to pour their wastewater into that courtyard, unless they have created a pit in the courtyard. You could imagine it's sort of like a septic tank. I mean, a place to receive wastewater in that courtyard, right? So the bottom line is, what are we concerned about here? Are we concerned that if they pour water into the courtyard and it's going to flow out of the courtyard, out into the public domain, that the person is going to violate the prohibition on carrying from a private domain to a public domain? And even though he doesn't carry the water out into the public domain, he's causing it, right? He's causing the water, which he pours into his courtyard. And it's predictable that if he pours enough water in the courtyard, it will flow out of the courtyard into the public domain. Is that the concern? That's the question that is being asked here. And as we'll see, it's a surprising answer. That actually isn't the reason that the rabbis are being careful about this. But the first question is, well, why are we making a distinction between a courtyard that is 4 by 4 cubits, right, about 6 feet by 6 feet, that if it's smaller than that, a pit is necessary, but if it's bigger than that, a pit is not necessary? Where do they get this distinction? Why that size? Rabbah says, because the amount of water that a normal person uses in a day and discharges in one form or another, the amount of water that, wastewater that comes out of a dwelling per person, is enough to sprinkle the dust over a dirt courtyard, which, like in the summer when it's very dry, like the dust will kind of rise, and people will just sprinkle a little bit of water. It still happens today. People have dirt courtyards. if they don't want the dust to kind of cloud up and get all over everything, they might sprinkle some water on it. And the amount of wastewater that is needed to keep the dust down in a courtyard is like the normal amount of water that a person gets rid of in a day is what you need to keep the dust down in a courtyard that's about 4 cubits by 4 cubits. And Rabbi Zera says it's a little different than that. It's simply that a courtyard that's 4 by 4 cubits can absorb the amount of water that a normal person puts out in a day. But more than that, but a smaller courtyard won't be able to absorb that much liquid, and you'll end up having puddles, which people don't want. And Rava says, right, and in the rainy season, when water's flowing all over the place anyway, we don't care, right? Whether you have a pit or not, whether your courtyard is small or big, when it's the rainy season and there's water all over, then you don't have to worry about how much water your residence is discharging into the courtyard. For anybody who's ever been in Jerusalem when it's raining, which I had that treat, I was there in November 2014 in Jerusalem, and it was pouring rain. And Jerusalem is actually very special in a pouring rain because there's a lot of very ancient type of streets where like the streets, they're all, you can't take cars there. It's only for walking. And the streets themselves have steps in them. And there's actually like a little notch cut into the center of every step going down these narrow and steep streets. And when it rains, it's like, like a sort of like a mini river flowing down the streets of Jerusalem. And it's pretty colorful to witness. Okay, so as we see, if you don't care in the rainy season because water is being transferred anyway, whether your particular water is being transferred out of your yard and into, out of the private domain and over to the public domain, so it seems like we're not really concerned about the transfer of this object, in this case the water, from your domain to the public domain. So what is it that the sages are concerned about? And it turns out that it's an issue of appearance of impropriety. Rava said to Abaye, well, there during the rainy season, there's no reason to prohibit the practice with regard to what we need to, with regard to what need we be concerned? If you say he wants the water to flow out into the public domain because he is concerned about spoiling and sullying his courtyard, well, it is already spoiled by the rainwater. And if you say it should be prohibited due to a decree, lest people say that so-and-so's gutter is flowing with water on Shabbos, which might lead them to think he is watering his garden or violating some other prohibition, and they might act likewise even in the summer, this is not a relevant concern. As gutters ordinarily flow with water in the rainy season, people do not entertain this suspicion. So the concern isn't that the water will flow out and it's a prohibited transfer of something from private domain to public domain because water isn't characterized that way, but rather that people will think that if water's, an unseemly amount of water is flowing out of your yard, it must be that you're doing some other labor which is prohibited on Shabbos, right? What you cannot do is water your garden. I'm not talking right now about sprinklers on timers. That's a different issue. Timers would seem to be permitted. I don't think anyone worries about, that if your sprinklers go on every night. I never thought about this before. I guess I'm going to have to look this up later, but it would seem that if you had your sprinklers on timers and they go off at 2 a.m. every night, so even if that happens on Friday night, I don't think you're violating Shabbos, but I need to check that. But if, but what you can't do is you yourself go out there and say, oh, there's a dry spot in my lawn. And you notice it on Shabbos, and then you go water it because then you're farming, right? You're contributing to the growth. You're doing work. It's prohibited, and you don't want your neighbors to think that you're doing work on Shabbos because maybe then they will come to think, oh, I guess it must be permitted to water my lawn because they see you do it, and then they're going to do it, and so you violated Shabbos, and then you led them to violate Shabbos. What the sages are saying, in the rainy season, we're not concerned about that because, there's just rainwater coming down from everybody's courtyard. So we see that there is this appearance of impropriety at the heart of the issue. That completes our discussion of the 9th Mishnah of chapter 8, and we're going to move on. If you have questions or comments, please put them in the comments. I'm going to come to it at the end. Our discussion of the first Mishnah of chapter 9 is going to be relatively brisk. Okay, so the first Mishnah here in chapter 9. This actually goes to something that we've discussed in the past. It was just a Mishnah that was mentioned in the Gemaras, in the discussions of earlier Mishnahs. But now here we're going to actually hear it. And this is that wonderful leniency of Rabbi Shimon. Now we know that in the absence of an Eruv, we're not going to be able to carry objects out of our house into our shared courtyard. And in the absence of a joint Eruv with the neighboring courtyard, we're not going to be able to carry an object from our house out to the courtyard and then over to the neighboring courtyard if that object started in the house. But we learned from Rabbi Shimon that objects which at the beginning of Shabbos, at the outset of Shabbos, right, at nightfall on Friday, if these objects which can be moved, right, so they're not muktzah, like, it's not like a lawnmower, which you can't touch on Shabbos, but a vessel like a bowl, right, a bowl that you could use to serve things. But let's say it started Shabbos not in your kitchen, but rather in your yard, so that you can pick up and move it around the yard. But not only that, per this ruling of Rabbi Shimon, you could take it from your yard to the neighboring yard, even though there's no joint Eruv between the yards. Because things that start Shabbos in a courtyard, it's as if they're part of this sort of master domain, the mega domain, which includes all courtyards and roofs and enclosures. So we've seen that before. This is the Mishnah that contains that ruling, but as we'll see, Rabbi Shimon is going much further than the other rabbis, and the question is, how did the law end up becoming like Rabbi Shimon? So, Mishnah number 1 of chapter 9. All the roofs of the city are considered one domain. It is permitted to carry from one roof to another, even if the residents of the houses did not establish an Eruv between them. The sages did not prohibit carrying between roofs, as it is rare to transfer an item from one roof to another. However, it is only permitted to transfer objects between roofs, provided that one roof is neither 10 handbreadths higher nor 10 handbreadths lower than the adjacent roof. This is the statement of Rabbi Meir. So Rabbi Meir says, with respect to rooftops, you can take objects on Shabbos from one rooftop to another, even if the two homes underneath those roofs did not make an Eruv with each other, provided that the two rooftops are pretty much on the same level. If one is more than 10 handbreadths higher than the other, that not that much, right? It's like about waist high. So if there's a difference of a few feet, maybe 1 meter, then this doesn't apply. But if the rooftops are on the same level, you can transfer stuff from one rooftop to another. And the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Meir say each and every one of the roofs is a domain in and of itself. It is permitted to carry from one to the other only if the residents of both houses established an Eruv. So the rabbis disagree with Rabbi Meir, and they say, no, each roof is its own domain. You cannot carry from one roof to another. Rabbi Shimon says, this is what I was talking about, roofs, courtyards, and enclosures are all one domain with regard to vessels that were inside them when Shabbos began. And one may therefore carry from one of these areas to another. However, they are not one domain with regard to vessels that were inside the house when Shabbos began and were later taken into one of the above domains. A vessel that was inside the house when Shabbos began and subsequently carried to one of these areas may be carried from one roof, courtyard, or enclosure to another only if an Eruv has been established between the domains. So that's Rabbi Shimon's huge leniency, much different than the other rabbis. How did he get there? It's gonna take a little while to find out. So first, let's discuss the first paragraph of this Mishnah, where it's Rabbi Meir versus the other rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Meir. With respect to his ruling that you can transfer from one rooftop to another as long as they're about the same level, Abaye bar Avin and Rabbi Chananya were sitting and talking, and Abaye was near them, and they said to Abaye, right? So Abaye bar Avin is not the same as Abaye. They have the same first name, but they're different people. So Abaye bar Avin and Rabbi Chananya say to Abaye, well, the rabbi's ruling is consistent with our understanding of houses, right? The houses below the rooftops, okay, makes sense. You can't carry from one house to another if there's no Eruv that joins the houses. Why is it that we can carry from one rooftop to another? So the rabbis are consistent. But Rabbi Meir says the roofs are different. And what they're asking Abaye is, okay, so he says that the roofs are different. But if they are different, then what difference does it make if one roof is more than 10 handbreadths higher than the other? If they're already going to say that the roofs are somehow a different realm than the houses beneath them, then what difference does it make if one roof is more than 10 handbreadths higher than the other? Already it's some kind of different realm. Like Rabbi Shimon doesn't make that distinction. Why does Rabbi Meir make such a distinction? And Abaye answers, the 10 tefachim difference, that difference of 10 handbreadths, which is going to prohibit you from transferring from one roof to another, this was a decree of Rabbi Meir in this situation because of concern that people will come to violate laws in a different situation. And this is akin to the fact that the rabbis decreed elsewhere that a person who, is carrying something in a public domain, and maybe there's it's almost like what is the situation where this happens? The point is that in a public domain, if you have a mound or a pillar which is more than 10 handbreadths high, and the surface of the pillar or the surface of the mound is more than 4 by 4 handbreadths in area, so that's its own private domain. And if you transferred an object from the ground in the public domain to the top of that pillar, then you would have violated the prohibition on transferring from public domain to private domain on Shabbos. So they said you can't do that. And because you can't do that with the pillar in a public domain, they also decreed that you can't do it in a private domain, lest people come to make that mistake in the public domain. In the private domain, it should be allowed because, even though it's on top of a pillar, it's just another private domain within a private domain. You'd think it would be subsumed within the larger private domain. But the concern was people would just become accustomed to make such transfers, like they have a load on their shoulder and they just want to rest it on this convenient and higher ledge, to rest their burden, and they would have actually performed a prohibited transfer. And so Rabbi Meir, when he said, you can transfer from one rooftop to another, but not if there's a difference in height, he was saying, and we don't want to sort of educate people to make transfers across these differences in height, because they might come to make mistakes in other situations where the difference in height really is a violation. Now, if the roofs are all on the same level, so just imagine a row of townhouses. Pretty easy to imagine. A row of townhouses, and they're all the same height. And from rooftop to rooftop, it's almost like from up there, it looks like one big courtyard. And we might even imagine that they don't have parapets, right? So, or they're low parapets. So there's like distinctions between the rooftops, but they're short. Maybe it's just like a little ledge between one rooftop to another. So it looks like one big rooftop for the whole block. So Rabbi Meir would say, okay, you can carry an object, even though these houses don't have an Eruv together, they haven't established an Eruv, you could carry objects from one rooftop to another, walking down the whole block on the rooftops. Rav says No way. It's not all one. I don't know where you get this idea that it's all one, different domain where the rooftops are different than the houses beneath them. In fact, if it's a different domain, it's different in the sense that this is like a public domain where you can only carry something 4 cubits, and that's it. That's the limit, right? On Shabbos, if you're out in a public domain and you're not within some kind of eruv, some kind of enclosure, so then you can carry objects only 4 cubits, and then you have to put it down. And so says Rav, with these rooftops, that's the situation. It's just like carrying on the street in a place where there's no eruv. You can only carry an object 4 cubits, and then you have to put it down. Shmuel says, no. Each roof is its own domain. So within the roof of a building, you can carry stuff around the building, around the rooftop of the building, in the same way that you could carry inside, right, indoors, in your house. You can pick up a book or a plate or anything you want and carry it all around your house. We don't worry about carrying within a private domain, and the roof is just like the rest of the house, according to Shmuel. But he doesn't hold like Rabbi Meir. He says you can't carry objects from one rooftop to another. And the rabbis who dispute Rabbi Meir seem to rule the same as Shmuel. But somehow the law ended up being like Rabbi Shimon, that not only rooftops, but courtyards and all enclosures, at least with respect to objects that started in those places, roof, courtyard, or enclosure, it's like they're all one domain. And you don't, even without having an eruv in place, you can carry from one courtyard to another, from one courtyard to a rooftop, from a rooftop to an enclosure, as long as the objects that are being carried didn't start at the outset of Shabbos indoors. Why is it that way? We're going to get to that tomorrow and the next day with God's help. All right. Let us look at comments and questions. Joy says, what about mikveh for women? Bathing for ritual cleansing purpose. Is there fear of splashing or wringing the towel? Or are there no prohibitions for this cleansing ritual? Just curious. I mean, it's my understanding that it is permitted to immerse in mikveh on Shabbos. I don't think we decree against that, almost for sure not. You can enter a mikveh on Shabbos. So we're not concerned about that. There's more concern about heating water. Splashing wouldn't matter in a mikveh because you're indoors. The splashing is where you're concerned that it's like you got a swimming pool, on the edge of a domain, and the water will splash out. First of all, a mikveh is usually not that large, but even if it is, it's a different concern. So mikveh is permitted on Shabbos. Okay, Nina had to go, so let me just check other comments and questions. Pauline is saying, challah is out of the oven, 2 huge loaves. Thank you, Nina, for your step-by-step demo. That's from yesterday's show. If you missed it, definitely good to check out Nina's challah baking show from yesterday. It was amazing. Carolyn says, would sunbathing on a rooftop be considered work? I can't imagine why it would be. I mean, it's the day of rest, and you're just going to rest outside in the sun. I think that's fine. I don't think that getting a little bit of sun on your skin is going to be considered cooking, as far as I can tell. So I don't think that is a concern. Tom says, it seems that the sages often trust the people to be sensible. I mean, it's really interesting, right? That sometimes they say, no, we can trust the people. It's okay. They know enough not to make that mistake. And other times they say, no, we got to make a decree that is really broad to protect them from coming to make this violation in their ignorance. And I think, there's not going to be a tremendous amount of consistency in that approach, right? Like sometimes they have to be severe and sometimes they're going to be much more lenient. Because I think it's important to remember that these laws were arrived at by a lot of sages disputing and discussing and arguing over centuries. And you can imagine that in certain communities, at certain times, the people were disrespectful and not listening to the sages. And at other places, they were quite pious and really being stringent upon themselves. And these rulings, over time are sort of going to average out to the best policy from the sages to keep people within the bounds of Torah law, which is the goal of all of this. Okay. And there's a discussion about an Israel trip. Yeah, that would be awesome. We'd love to lead an Israel trip, in the future at some point. We've discussed that before, but it would be great to do. All right, that's what I've got for us today. Thank God we're heading into Shabbos. May the peace of Shabbos enfold us all, provide comfort in these very stressful times. But there is one truism that has just always been true. I don't think that I think it's even in the Bible somewhere. I'm not sure where it is in the Bible. If somebody can help me with that, let me know. Maybe it's in Proverbs somewhere. But there's definitely a story that Abraham Lincoln liked to tell. And he said that an emperor or a king, once called in all of the wise men of the world. Somehow he was able to gather the wisest men in the world, the wisest people in the world. And he said to them, everything seems to change all the time. I want you to tell me what is true and will remain true always, no matter what changes in the world. What is a truism that will remain true, guaranteed, right? And often people will answer, well, death and taxes, right? Those things are always going to be true. But what this gathering of wise people said to the king, first of all, they got together and they discussed this for weeks, right? And they sort of proposed so many things and said, no, well, that could change. People's opinions could change. Politics could change. Power structures could change. Pandemics and epidemics and plagues can come and upset the balance of everything. But then they finally concluded there is one statement that will remain true for all time. This too shall pass. So my friends, whatever's going on now, this too shall pass. With God's help, we'll live to see another and brighter day. We'll get back into the business of unifying our communities and our nations, and focusing as the human family on what is important, right? What is important in this world, comforting and caring for each other, and perhaps if we do a better and better job at that, we will merit to see the coming of Mashiach ben David, the anointed one who will announce the great and awesome day of the coming of the Lord, and we'll enter the Messianic age, and then we'll understand why we had to go through so much pain and suffering throughout human history. We can't really understand it yet, but if we have faith, we know that there's a purpose for everything under the sun. And God is both all-powerful and all-good, and eventually we'll understand what God was, intending with everything that's happening around us. Have a great, great Shabbos.